Uh, Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining this data versioning interest group plenary session. We have a session title called for community input on practical recommendations for implementing data versioning principles. We have a group co-chairs Jens and Leslie myself on this call. Unfortunately, Kirsten is not available for this meeting. So the collaborative notes, we have a short link for the collaborative notes. It's also the link is also available from the Zoom chat. We will use these collaborative notes extensively in this meeting. So please, open that collaborative notes and assign your name in as well. And if you have any questions or comments, you can put in the Zoom chat. And also be aware that this meeting is recorded. So here is the agenda for today. First, I will give a brief introduction of the group. And also brief update on the revised or new version of data versioning use case document. And then Jens will lead the discussion, and this is a major agenda for today to get your input on this new output in preparation is practical recommendations for implementing data versioning principle. We allocate ample time for your input on this. Then we will wrap up and take action forwards. So, in introduction of the group, the drivers for this data versioning interest group, and also previously data versioning working group, there are three key critical drivers. One is reproducibility, because the data versioning is very critical for the research reproducibility. We need to be able to identify exactly version or release of data that being used in research. And then it's about data quality and provenance, and data through lots of changes during its life cycle, and involve different process and changes, and these changes need to be captured and documented in each release or version. And the third driver is about the authorship, authority, identity, and ethics. So a lot of people may be involved in the revision of data, so their contribution should be acknowledged. And also, we need to identify the origin or authority version of data, so can trace back all those provenance I'm talking about. So that's the three drivers we identified when we started this data versioning interest group. If you see the other reasons or drivers need for the data versioning, you can put them in Zoom chat. And here is a brief history about this interest group. It's dated to 2016, so 9 years now. So we started both to gather ideas about this interest group. So evidently people, supported that. Then we formally started this interest group in 2017. When we started the interest group, started discussion about the data versioning, we identified some tangible output that could be produced. That's we started a working group on on those tangible items or output, namely data versioning principles. We will introduce shortly. So I guess probably many people here know the difference between the interest group and a working group, because a working group is given 18 months like a time span to deliver. So after we delivered that principle, then we transfer back into this interest group. So bring all the conversations into the interest group. So after we produce this data principle output from the working group, so there was suggestions from members say we need a practical guideline how to implement the data versioning principles that has been focused through of this interest group in last few plenary meetings. So when we transfer from working group to interest group, so we have 3 specific goals. So firstly, to communicate and promote the data versioning principles that became supporting output from the data versioning working group. And secondly, as I mentioned earlier, we want to develop practical recommendations for adopt the data versioning principle. And thirdly, this interest group is like any other interest group, can serve as a forum for discussing issues related to data versioning, data republication, and also the mirroring and the reuse data. While we working on these, these specific goals, we also keep in mind that we discussion we have here could contribute to other RDA groups or start a new interest group or working group if there is no overlap with other existing RDA groups. So the 2 outputs from the data versioning working group, we try and continue to communicate and promote. One is a collection of data versioning use case. At the time, it was adopted as the supporting output. It had a 39 use case that was about two or 3 years ago, but now the latest version has grown to 54 use cases. And also the second output is this data versioning principles. The RDA supporting output has more comprehensive version, but a more concise version of the principles is published to the Data Science Journal. So how we coming up with these principles? So it based on the analysis of the 39 use cases we had at the time. And also we use the existing versioning examples like a software, well-established software versioning, as well as a conceptual framework. That's by library information system, namely functional requirements for bibliographic record. Basically, is describe an entity relationship of one information resources to another. So we thought it's a good conceptual framework to guide us to analyze use case. And from there, we developed the 6 foundational principles. And in these principles, or use this framework, we use the concept of the 4 paths of data. So that covers from, that's what the further framework about, to start from when you have ideas to start a project, to collect the data, to the point you publish data. That whole journey of collecting to publish data. And also we pretty aware that nowadays it's very rare for research to use a single data set. So when we're talking about revision, it's covered not just a single data set, but also collections of multiple data set or data items. So that's the journey. We derived the data versioning principles. The URL there can lead to the paper describes all principles in detail. So the I mentioned earlier, here is a framework, the 4-way framework we used to guide the derive the principles. It started from intellectual distinct intellectual artist creation. For example, start from ideas of project. From there, we concrete the need to express that idea or data set in some way. Then is physical embodiment of that content, in a book, or is a tangible outcome of that intellectual work. Then it's at the item level, you have to deliver that content in various forms. It's just like a book in library bookshelf. That's one item, or one data set is downloadable data set. That's an item. So also at the plenary 20, when we presented this framework, there was a suggestion, say, oh, FOBR is too complicated. Library probably use the BibFrame. There was a recommendation, should we use a BibFrame? So we reviewed that, then we thought BibFrame probably is more for the practical implementation of FOBR. So we continue to use the FOBR as a conceptual framework. And also the software, we also adopt lots of concept from software versioning in the principles. So probably Leslie will be best person to explain this example, but I can try. So for example, if we use this framework to describe 4 parts of dataset, we start with ideas. We need to get data from this ice core from certain position of time, for example. Then we could express this kind of work or intellectual ideas in a paper. And also, we also do exercises to, want to capture data and to deliver product from this core. And then the idea of the paper is in a print version, is published in print version, or could be in print version paper or electronic PDF version that's shown the idea, the work around that grape ice core. But for the data set can be manifested in the or delivered by the CSV file from the Nova, or could be CSV file, or just or any other data format from Pangaea. And then you have the publishers who or library who made these items to deliverable, or data repositories to make the data product available. So in this framework, we can identify the whole path of from the data ideas to creation, and also will help us to identify, for example, if there are 2 versions of a data set, are they come from same work, or are they come from different work? So that impact on the how we describe and related one version to another. So by using this framework, we come 6 data versioning principles. So when we analyze the use cases, we realize that people use a term version, revision, release, and use the same term mean different things. So first thing, the principle we want to give a definition to mean what we mean revision. Data through through the change all the time. So we need to capture and identify each change or each revision. So we can use version control system to capture that each revision. Each revision could lead lead to a bitstream change in dataset. A good example is dynamic data versioning. Data changing all the time. How do you identify a change at a point at a time? And you can do many revisions or change of data, but at a certain point when revision needed to significant change, or you want to release or publish that version. So each release is a public facing. Not all revision could be public facing, but each release is a public facing version that can should have a significant change be captured in the release. And also and how to numbering the version. So so when you release, we could identify is release significant change, minor change, or bug fix if we follow the software versioning or release examples. And the third principle is about data granularity. That's I mentioned earlier. If you work with a collection of data that has many data items, objects, or time series data, data increase over the time, and how are you able to identify the whole collection, but also the items in each in a collection. And the fourth principle is manifestation, and that's a different format of the same data product. So do we give the data set can be published in different version, different format, we call the manifestation. So we need to identify, which kind of format be used, because during the transformation of one data format to another, it could have error. So we need to know exactly what the format be used. And the fifth principle is provenance. So between each release, or we should document it that any changes or significant changes also provide information what is the precursor version relationship between two versions. And finally, is the about the citation of specific version. So in data citation recommendations, sorry about typo there. So recommended to include the version numbers in a citation. So here are 6 principles. That was a result from the working group. And yeah, so that's a brief context about this interest group and the working group have done so far. So for this session, we have 2 major objectives. One is to bring your attention to the new version of the use case, data versioning use case, and the second objective is to update and seek your input to these practical recommendations. So very brief. So we collected data versioning use case. We just collected this use case as they were from either from data repositories or from literature review. Then we compiled in version 1, we compiled 69, and we keep adding to that, and now is 54. So this link can lead to that current the compilation of the use case. And when you have time after the plenary, please have a review of these use cases. If you have new use cases, It would be great if you can add to that. Our intention is to wrap up this work of collecting user cases to get RDS advice, either to publish this new version or take this new version as supporting output. Yeah, but anyway, the attention here is to wrap up this user case work, collection work. Next, we will get your input on these practical recommendations. I will let Jens take over on this.
Thanks, Ming, for
yeah. Sorry, I just wonder if people have any questions about principles.
Yes. You can also put questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Then just as look at the agenda again, what we will do now for the remainder of the sessions is to look at the practical recommendations. We've given you an overview of the principles so far, but when it comes to translating this into practice, we found that too often we had to say it depends on what to do, and that is unsatisfactory. So we took this on board for this interest group to develop actionable recommendations. And Ming, do you want to keep on driving the slide? Then let's move to the next slide. Just as a reminder, this of our collaborative notes, and in the notes, when we scroll down, you will see that there are blocks of questions relating to each of the actionable recommendations. So as we go through them, you can add your comments, and so we have them recorded and can incorporate your feedback into the document that we will produce. So let's go to the first principle of revision. This is all about noticing the changes in the bit stream of a digital object, and in following the practices in software development, we defined this as a revision, and like in software, when you check your edited file back into a versioning system, that's counted up as a revision. And our recommendation is, in the easiest case, to use a file-based system and use systematic names and folder names and so on, following the recommendations of data carpentry. And this approach, we think, is suitable if you work on your own or within a small collaboration with not too many files. But once you work in a larger collaboration on file-based data, we recommend to use Git for smaller files, or data versioning control for larger files. And this approach, we think, is suitable for collaborating in groups, as the technology already supports data sharing and documentation and the recording of provenance. And I think in parallel to us right now is a session by the Dynamic Data Working Group, who have ended that working group phase quite a while ago, but are still in maintenance mode to follow up on implementations, and their recommendations are very relevant to highly dynamic data, in particular data stored in relational databases. And for data in relational databases and similar setups, we recommend to follow the recommendations of this dynamic data working group. Does this make sense?
So let me switch to the collaborative notes. So yeah, so that's the recommendation Jens
You're
talked
in the
about.
wrong. Can you scroll up because you're in the deleted items
Oh,
of the text?
sorry.
Sorry.
I have little
Yeah,
yeah,
here we are.
sorry. Yeah. So if you yeah, give a few minutes later about these recommendations just to see if it's write down your thought and the insight, if anything else should be covered or not clear.
I think this one's the easiest one because it
Mm.
is so similar to software development. But in the in software development, we're basically dealing with a text-based file that changes all the time. Maybe we should move on to the definition of a release,
Okay.
because that was a bit bigger step, and because revision is something that you can see as a technical process. You finding out whether the bit stream of an object has changed is a technical step that you can automate. There are systems around, and that's pretty straightforward. The definition of a release is a step further from the revision. And here we say data sets undergo several changes before you make them available to other users. And this is an editorial process where you take an editorial decision at one point to say, okay, so this revision of a data set we now want to make available to other users, and we want to release it. So it's called a release. And our recommendations on this are to establish workflows for creating and identifying data releases. So creating meaning to have an editorial process that lets you decide which revision of that data set you want to officially release, and have a way of naming it, have a way of identifying it. And an important component of this process is also to use release notes. And these release notes should be used to communicate the significance of the change and record the provenance of the data. So we're already pointing towards the issue of provenance, but the significance of change is something that is also very well covered by the concepts of semantic versioning, where we're all familiar with 1.0, 1.1, 1.11, and so on. With the different positions telling you something about the significance of the change, which when you change when the release only changes in the third position, it's just a bug fix. It will not change anything. It will just fix a bug. In a position in the second, a change in the second position is usually seen as a change that is significant but doesn't break anything. It's still backward compatible. While a change in the first position signifies that there's a major change in this release, and it might not be backwards compatible.
Yes, you
Yeah,
can.
there's a
Sometimes
question from Lara about whether release notes are standardized or in any way, whether they're just text. More or less, yes. There's in the recommendations, we link to a web page as a reference that describes how to create release notes that are meaningful to the users. And user communities around particular softwares have conventions in how they communicate the significance of a change. And the illustration that just popped up on the screen is to explain in how to use identifiers to identify different releases of a data set. And so they're basically arranged in horizontal swim lanes across the screen. And the first release of this data set is up on the left-hand side in time 1. I gave it a pseudo identifier that looks a bit like a DOI, but it's just for illustration purposes. So in the next release, whoever created this data set inserted and appended more material, more data to this data set. So the new release has a new identifier, but the old release is still around. And then there's a time step 3 where there's another addition appended to the data set. So this new release of this data product gets a new identifier while the previous 2 releases are still available. And like some publishers use kind of an umbrella object to encompass all of those releases and always direct users to the latest release, but also with the option to go to the previous releases. And that's the box at the top that should signify that there's an kind of an encompassing umbrella object that encompasses all releases of this particular data set or data product.
Is another example.
And here's another example where when you deal with time series, you can do this in a different way when the time series just deals with additions where you append the data set, and you can then identify snapshots of that and release them as individual views or releases of that data. And that could be done either by giving them new identifiers, or as some repositories do, use a canonical path implemented as template persistent identifiers that direct you to that position that you want to access. So that's the hash notation that is used in template identifiers. Does this resonate with your practices in the repositories that you deal with, or with your user experiences? It's quite a lot of material in a short period of time.
Laura? Yeah.
Yes, I can just try to ask a question, because I see, so I don't know how many of your use cases actually fit in these 2 examples. So it looks to me, these 2 that you just presented, they're quite different. So with this sort of appending in time, I find it easier to connect to in a sense. It's very clear that this is still the same data set, it's just extended in time maybe. And yeah, I would say it makes sense. For the previous one, it's a bit harder for me to connect to it because it depends on the changes that have been doing, the people have been doing to that specific data set. So will it be at some point that this is actually not really the same data set and it's a new, so it's not really a new version, but it's really a new data set because it looks more like software approach. It would make more sense. So then you have a very specific purpose for that software, and then you make changes and you develop it further, new functionalities and so on. But with the data set, of course, it's different. So I don't know if you have been putting thoughts into this specific use case with respect to when actually the changes are such that it's better to create a new DOI and a new data set for a new release.
Yeah, that is a very good question, and we have thought about this because the particular use case we had for this pattern was that we had a time series where corrections to the data were added retrospectively. So it wasn't just extended as time went on with new data, but also people went back in time and corrected parts of the data set because there were reasons for changes in the processing algorithm or changes in the sensor or correction factors. And so we wanted to find a pattern that allowed us to describe both a continuously growing data set, which is just continuously appended, but also the case where you go back and insert a correction for whatever reason. And so the question, is this still the same data set, is a very valid question. And we try to look at this as a data product that, like a piece of software, comes in different releases. It's still the same data product because it comes from the same idea, it comes from the same experiment or same observational setting, but it has been reprocessed for whatever reason.
So in that case, yes, like the work is still the same, but the expression different.
Yeah, you could
Then
say that if you say that this is a different data product, but it could also be still the same expression, but the expression comes in a new revision because you've reworked it, you've reprocessed it, but it's still the same data product. But you could, and that's it. We come back to it depends on is this change a significant change that your user community cares about and they would see as really significantly different? Or is this just an improvement that doesn't really change the meaning, but it has some bugs removed? So
I think that
maybe we
yeah.
need some even more tangible use cases, because the use cases that we've collected so far are, in a way, the general procedures that people have described as their versioning practices. But to have very concrete examples of existing data sets that people can go to and see how this particular situation was handled by a data center.
Hmm.
So in short, we have to make it even less abstract. Tove?
Yeah. Good morning. I have a little question about how do you manage the tracking of your versions, because you have names of different versions, right? Here on this use case, and how do you find the differences between them? Is it inside the metadata or anything else?
Yeah, this is something important in the process of a release and the release notes, that you have a convention that your users understand how you name versions, whether you name them 1, 2, 3, and so on, or sometimes you give them names. Like when you look at the QGIS software, they have both names and numbers. It's what your user community is familiar with and understands. And
Okay.
I think at the moment, the most popular way of then naming releases is semantic versioning, the 1.0, 1.1, and so on.
Okay, so this convention is proper to the community. There's no global convention about that.
No, there's a very nice Wikipedia page that lists about 20 different ways of naming versions. And it's quite entertaining
Got
to
it.
read.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe move on to the next one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So granularity is so the expression of a data product can be a whole set of data items. And sometimes the number of files of items associated with this product can be quite large. And then the question of granularity is about what is the smallest identifiable unit that you want to identify by a persistent identifier. And our recommendations for this situation are identify the collection or at this collection item level, and identifying the individual items can be useful, but sometimes it's impractical because sometimes you might have tens of thousands to tens of millions of objects in a collection. And minting persistent identifiers for all individual items would be really impractical and expensive. So what data repositories who are faced with this situation do is they mint persistent identifiers on demand. So only when somebody really needs an identifier, accesses a particular item, then they mint an identifier for that item. But the collection is always identified. And time series, we again see as a kind of a special case of a collection where the data are only appended and are not inserted into the time series. They're only appended to the end. And then you can easily identify the entire time series with one persistent identifier and use canonical path or template persistent identifiers to identify subsets of this time series. So it's an analogy to a journal where in the olden days you would have one library card for nature not for every issue of Nature, and not even for every volume. This would be just one, and it would be just an ongoing open time series. So the next slide has an illustration, just like a box cartoon, where the collection item would be this box on the top that then encompasses all items in that collection, which in this case have all been individually identified. Again, the identifiers here are only for illustration purposes. They're not real identifiers. So again, this use case exists, and we should put it into the use case document to support our recommendation.
Mm.
So mirroring and republication, that is an interesting thing that only became possible with data being available on the internet. And it can have some interesting consequences, but let's first look at the situation. What we're defining here is that a data item is mirrored from one platform to another platform. And in our recommendations for mirroring and republications are that the mirrored or republished data should always refer to the original source, which we call the authoritative version, using the is identical to attribute in the DataCite metadata. So that if you find an item in a data portal and it is mirrored or republished from its original source, you can always go back to the original source, find the authoritative version of this item or this data product. And is identical to as an attribute in the DataCite metadata is a little bit ambiguous. So and well, DataCite metadata 4.5 has been published, but for the next version of the DataCite metadata, we should request that it also adds an attribute that points to the authoritative version, not just as identical to.
So yes, so this authoritative version is used for not just for mirror or republish. There are cases people create, a new data set from authority version, or subsetting make a variable. Or then maybe not in this, not called a mirror or republication. Yeah.
No,
But
that would be a
the
derivative.
authoritative, yeah.
But when it's really identical, but just in a different place, you would still want to know whether this identical object is this a mirrored or republished item, or is it actually the authoritative version? Martina, you have your hand up.
Thanks. I'd like to comment on that recommendation. I understand that why you come up with these two persistent identifiers registered by two different authorities should be connected by the is identical attribute. But implicitly you say, well, if there are two replicas somewhere, there should be two persistent identifiers. You don't say it, but implicitly it's somehow behind your recommendation. And there are federated infrastructures which maintain the handles centrally. So you can republish the data, but it has just a second option for download, but is not registering a new persistent identifier. And maybe to distinguish it from versions, if it's possible, I would even say it's the preferable recommendation. So if it's possible to really say, as long as the data has the same checksum, the better way is to keep the same persistent identifier, and only if it's not possible, you assign for the same data a new persistent identifier. That actually would be my recommendation or my way forward for this case.
Yeah, that makes sense. But there was a use case a few years ago where the metadata differed. So in the authoritative case, the metadata was more rich, while the republished data set only had the subset of the metadata. So the checksum was the same, even though there's problems with the checksum concept, but because it depends on the character set that you use to encode it. But you could do that.
Maybe I can give the example what I was thinking of. So in the System Grid Federation on the dataset granularity, we really use the concept of publishing the persistent identifier when the first data set is published, and any replica just is added as an additional download option.
Yeah,
So it is somehow used, and for the ESGF, I think it's easier because it makes it more obvious what is a new version and what is a replica.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in this coordinated case, it sounds like the best way forward. What we had here in mind was when there is not such a tight coordination, like in the case when Figshare republished data from Pangea. And so it would have been clearer if, I mean, Figshare didn't hide the fact that they had the data from Pangea, but they had less rich metadata. So you couldn't, there were differences where if you just looked at the checksum, yes, it was the same. There's some things with how Pangea delivers data that makes checksums not so useful. So for these less clear cases, less coordinated cases, it would be better. And sometimes, I think we should describe both. Where,
yeah, agreed.
Yeah, yes.
Not omit the other case completely.
Yes.
Especially if I look into your recommendation for the manifestations, then you have the same PID for two files which are different manifestations and different checksums.
Exactly. So I think Christine's question.
So the same authority question.
Yeah, and when you look at different manifestations, you can't use the checksum anymore to see whether they are identical in content or how they relate to each other.
I was more hinting at the one authority question. Then you can remain with one PID.
Yeah, that's right. Lara.
Yes, so two comments, and I don't know if this could also be a new use case, meaning with respect to republication and mirroring of dataset with different identifiers. I'm running a data center that aggregates. So we harvest from Pangea, for example, and we harvest also from other sources. The main issue here is that we do use, of course, the identifiers to remove duplicates when we harvest. And then when you don't have the same identifiers, of course, you pick up the same records from two different sources. And then for our users that, of course, browse our catalog, then they find exactly the same title, the same more or less everything, but with different identifiers. And that's very confusing. So this is quite a big issue for us. So it happens very often that you end up having the same things but with different identifiers, and there's no way for us to sort of remove these duplicates. So it has to be kept in mind here that it's it can be quite a big issue. Second, we also have some republication of records. And this is mainly to enhance services on top of data. So there are some archive on some repositories that just provide the download of data. So for example, you have this big bundle, and then if you want to download it, you need to download 1 tera of data, for example. And a lot of people can't do that. So for example, in some cases, we take this data, we reformat it, we sort of reformatted in NetCDF, for example, and supply opened up protocols to access data so that people don't need to download the full bundle, but they can access all the different files in that data set or in that bundle separately with a very little effort. And we do keep the identifier. So it is a different, this is also the question that popped up in the chat. It is the same data set, it's just a different format, but the values are exactly the same and the metadata is exactly the same. But of course, checksum won't work. And we have been recently actually talking about how to link if this is identical to or is a transformation of. There are several ways. We are a bit unsure. So for now, we thought that is identical to is actually fitting the purpose, but I'm not sure. I don't know if you have any more suggestions about this then.
Yeah, and this this question exactly came up in the context of discussing aggregators. How do you then, how as an aggregator can you find out that you have already harvested something if they have different identifiers? And so having this attribute in the metadata would be helpful to identify that you already have this, but from a different source. And the other question was, I think, more about the manifestations, and we'll come back to that very shortly in a few minutes when we talk about formats. And let's revisit that in a few minutes. But are there still comments on mirroring and republication?
I guess another reason, like republish with a new like DOI or pay, is that publisher want to get attribution to the service they provide. So that's probably because when you count DOI, just count DOI by the site, the download or citation. If you provide a republish or mirroring data, then use original DOI, you wouldn't get any credit for provide such a service. That's probably one driver for those to mint a new DOI. But for them to get a credit, but not benefit users.
That is certainly a factor, but that might also be changing as with very large data sets, you don't want to download a 1 terabyte data set more than once if you can avoid it. So what does that then mean? If that really brings down the numbers. No, yeah, it's the original case was how do you properly count the downloads, but then it's again becoming apparent that counting download numbers isn't really the best metric to assess impact. But this is maybe also a good segue to the next slide, where we look at deleted items and retractions. And so sometimes a data set is retracted because there were problems with it. Sometimes it disappears. And I think we're finding ourselves in a situation at the moment in the global political scene where data sets are endangered and are being republished in other places to keep them alive. But for deleted items and retractions, we decided to follow the practices that are common with other more traditional electronic publications, and to then say if data have become unavailable, the principle is always that a persistent identifier should always resolve to a landing page, displaying the metadata even when the data set has become unavailable. There might be exceptional circumstances where even the metadata are lost, and then just in those cases, persistent identifiers should resolve to tombstone page that then that explains what has happened, why neither data nor metadata are any longer available. And for the case of retractions, like in other scientific publications, display the metadata with an appropriate release note that describes that the data has been retracted. And with appropriate release note, we mean sometimes you go into more detail of why this decision was taken, and sometimes it just says that it has been retracted. That it can be just a technical issue, it can be very touchy political issue, depending on your situation. So appropriate release note was the term we chose. Provenance. So the kind of dictionary definition is the known history of something, and our recommendations here are to use the release notes to record provenance. And maybe as things become more standardized in this field, there will be machine readable versions of that. And then linking back to revision management, using Git, for instance, for revision management, because it automatically records provenance. And most Git platforms also support release management with accompanying release notes.
Yeah, I just move through the slides because we don't have much time left, and then come back to each one.
I think this question about formats or manifestations is an important one. So the definition, as a refresher, is the expression is the content of a data product, and the manifestation is how it's formatted. And the item is the individual file that you download from a server. And our recommendation here is looking at variants of formats, and that the metadata of a data product, the expression, should record that there are different format variants. as we call them, manifestations of data. And when it comes to identifying them with persistent identifiers, the manifestations, we haven't come across any cases where manifestations have been separately identified with persistent identifiers, but that might change if somebody sees the need to do that. So to, again, illustrate what we mean, maybe we go to the next slide. So in this example, this was my thinking about the data from the GRIP Greenland Ice Core that I used extensively in my PhD, but I actually only looked at the oxygen isotopes. I never cared much about all the glaciology behind it. So I always wondered what I should cite. Should I cite the Nature paper that I didn't really refer to, or should I cite the oxygen isotope curve that I downloaded from Pangea? And this pattern is a suggestion on how to deal with this, where Dansgaard's concept of the GRIP Ice Core project is the work, and it has been expressed, for instance, in a Nature paper, which is manifested in its print version, and the library item of this print version is available in your library, if you still have one. And then it's also manifested as the PDF version available through Springer Nature that you can download from their server as a PDF file. And then some of this work is also expressed as a data product, as the oxygen isotope data that NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, releases from its as in CSV format to download from their server, if that's still available. And then Pangea has the oxygen isotope data in a different format to the NOAA version to download from the Pangea server. So coming back to Christine's question about data in the data formats. Data format is all about the manifestation. And if say the PDF is available on 2 different servers as 2 separate items, but the content and the checksum are the same, they're the same manifestation, they all link back to the same expression of that work with its identifier. And whether the 2 items then have separate identifiers or not, that's more or less what Martina referred to in how these atmospheric model data are distributed, where they are all the same expression, the same manifestation, but they come as items on different servers. So in her use case, it doesn't make sense to give separate identifiers to all the separate items because they're all the same, and you can summarize them at the expression level. But in other cases, there might be enough subtle differences on the item level that it makes sense to identify them separately. So this all then leads to this question of citation. And what this whole idea about citing data sets is to give credit to the creator of this data product by citing usually the expression, because at that level that it encompasses all the manifestations, all the items. Sometimes for the sake of reproducibility, it would be useful to reference the item that you actually worked with. But from that perspective, it gives credit to the infrastructure that provided access to this resource. So there's a little bit of a tension between the individual infrastructures at providing access and the creator of the data product that is the creator of all of these items at the expression level. So that's but that's a conflict that's still unresolved. We might follow up on this in the future life of this interest group. So our recommendations on the matter of citation are follow established practices for citation and scholarly communication. It's still not universally accepted by all journals, but we should push for it. And credit is given to the creator of the data product by citing the expression. And there might be use cases for citing the item to give credit to the infrastructure providing access to the data product. This might skew the metrics in case of mirrored data. There might be good reasons to do that for the sake of reproducibility. We should add that last sentence. And last but not least, a question that has come up several times is, should we version metadata separately? And in the past, my position was no, because if you change the library card, the book doesn't change. But if you change the book, you should change the library catalog. But there are definitely use cases now where this matters, especially with metadata aggregators. So sometimes in metadata aggregation and republication, the metadata change, and there might be valid use cases to identify those different metadata versions separately. But we ditched this concept 20 years ago because we saw that it caused a lot of confusion to understand which identifier referred to the metadata and which identifier referred to the data object itself. And so even before DataCite was founded, what later became DataCite aborted this idea of identifying metadata. But I think now with metadata aggregators, we should revisit it and see how best we make use of this to disambiguate metadata records in aggregating systems. And then we collected some recommendations on versioning systems. Firstly, use version control systems, but also match their complexity to the needs. So it has to be fit for purpose and for the user community. And that also means it has to be usable and accessible. It should be easy to use, available on the necessary platforms, and people should be familiar to avoid confusion. And then as you, in the decision process, which one to choose, think about how it integrates into your infrastructure and whether you have the support in place to maintain it and support the users, and make it fit for purpose, focus on the practical application so that the system works in your real world research environment, not just conforming to some theoretical capabilities. So this leaves us with a few minutes to the end of the session to hear your comments on our recommendations. And also the question, what do we do next as interest group?
Yeah, lots of materials. Christian?
Yes, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I didn't understand really what we have to do concerning the citation. What is the recommendations to cite the item or to stay at the expression citation? It was not so clear for me.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Let's go back to that citation slide. So there are two options that you have. You can, in line with how we usually cite in scholarly communications, is that we want to give credit to the creator of this work. And so here we would cite the expression of a data product, or give credit to the creator of the data product by citing the expression. There maybe you want to give credit to the infrastructure, or the infrastructure wants credit for providing access to the data, and then it would be possible to cite at the item level, and also for reproducibility purposes, citing at the item level, say I used this item for my work, might be useful. So it has two contradicting parts, whether we want to cite at the expression level to give credit to the creator of the product, or whether we want to cite at the item level to give credit to the infrastructure. And especially when data are mirrored across several, or federated across several platforms, if you cite the expression, it's unclear where you downloaded it. But if you cite the item, then you give credit to one infrastructure and the other partners lose out. So the easy answer is cite the expression. I hope I answered the question.
Or some data provider put the recommended citation. Yeah.
Or we can cite the expression and say that it was downloaded with the item.
Yep, that's also possible. We could add that. We could add that to the recommendations.
Okay, so lots of material we went through. So if you have any comments, even after the plenary, you can still put your comments in the collaborative notes, or drop email to either chairs on the call. Not just to the recommendations, but if you have a new use cases that could add to that user case collection, yeah, please keep in contact with us. So our intention is to wrap up the use case soon, but for these recommendations, we will keep working on that until next plenary. So trying to finalize that in the next plenary. So yeah, so plenty of time for your contribution to these recommendations. And apart from this use case and the recommendations, are there any other topics related to data versioning you would like this interest group to discuss? Mhm. If no further feedback, we can close this session. Yeah, we will use the interest group, the wiki space or post to communicate if any new development on the recommendation. With that, thank you all for participating in this session. And Jens, you want to conclude this session?
Well, thank you everybody for your contributions. And if you're not part of the group yet, please join the group so we can keep you updated on the developments. And we hope to see you again next time. And please write to us and contribute to the documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye, everyone.